Francis Bacon and the law in his early Shakespeare plays as reflected in his life and acknowledged writings. Shakespeare was a lawyer. Most Shakespeare scholars and students are not likely to be familiar with the breadth, depth and full extent of the law found in the Shakespeare plays, so I thought it might be useful to quote the following Lord Chancellor, judges, lawyers and those law and literary scholars who specialise in the subject, who succinctly illuminate it. Lord Campbell said, "Having concluded my examination of Shakespeare's juridical phrases and forensic allusions, on the retrospect I am amazed, not only by their number, but by the accuracy and propriety with which they are uniformly introduced. There is nothing so dangerous as for one not of the craft to tamper with our Freemasonry." Richard Grant White said, "Legal phrases flow from his pen as part of his vocabulary and parcel of his thought." William Lowes Rushton, "His works contain passages displayed not merely a knowledge of the principles and practice of the law of real property, but also of the common law and of the criminal law, and a thorough intimacy with the exact letter of the statute law." Lord Penzance remarked, "I allude to his perfect familiarity with not only the principles, axioms and maxims, but the technicalities of English law. The mode in which this legal knowledge was passed into the service on all occasions to express his meaning and illustrate his thought was quite unexampled. He seems to have had a special pleasure in his complete and ready mastering of it all in its branches." Judge Webb said, "If anything is certain in regard to the sonnets, the poems and the plays, it is certain that the author was a lawyer." Quill Driver remarked, "In Bacon's law tracts, speeches and aphorisms are to be found all the profound and accurate knowledge which Shakespeare displayed of juridical principles and practice." Judge Nathaniel Holmes said, "I cite the following instances with some additional circumstances as going to show not only that the author of Shakespeare was a lawyer, but that lawyer was Francis Bacon." From an early age, one way or another, it appears that Francis Bacon was destined to hold in his hands the helm of the kingdom. He was raised by the great Tudor lawyer and statesman Sir Nicholas Bacon and his learned wife Lady Anne Bacon, one of the greatest translators of the 16th century, fluent in Greek, Latin, Italian and French. When Elizabeth ascended to the throne in November 1558, she immediately appointed Sir William Cecil her principal Secretary of State, and with a reputation for his learning in law, not long after she appointed Sir Nicholas Bacon as Lord Keeper and de facto Lord Chancellor of England. In his long and successful tenure as head of the Court of Chancery, Sir Nicholas Bacon proved to be the greatest Lord Keeper and Lord Chancellor of the 16th century. He implemented a wide progressive programme of law reforms, including sweeping changes in the standards and operations of the Court of Assizes, as set out in his speech shortly after his appointment as Lord Keeper of the Realm. In her recent groundbreaking chapter, The Assize Circuitry of Measure for Measure, in the aptly titled Legal Reform in English Renaissance Literature, Professor Strain frames and commences it with the policy words set out by Lord Keeper Nicholas Bacon in his parliamentary speeches, policies that were later woven into the text of Measure for Measure by his son Francis Bacon. In his closing oration, the Lord Keeper Bacon addressed the country's provincial magistrates, admonishing them to put into practice the statutes that were especially prioritised by central policy. At the turn of the 17th century, the Court of Assize was responsible for overseeing and reforming the execution of local justice and governance throughout the country. The Assizes, I argue, supply a historical analogue through which the representation and reformation of legal administration in Measure for Measure can be newly analysed. The major feature of the Assize system all inform the plot and the characterisation of legal officers in Measure for Measure. As an adviser to James I, to his favourites, and as Lord Chancellor, his son Francis would take pains to advocate and institute the investigation of local officers as a vital function of the assize judges, who were already responsible for holding court throughout the country during law term vacations. I argue that the assize judges' responsibility for the oversight of local justice informs the structure and ethics of Measure for Measure. Following in the footsteps of Nicholas Bacon, Francis Bacon would eventually emulate his father in the next reign with successive appointments as Solicitor General, Attorney General, Lord Keeper and Lord Chancellor of England. But all this lay ahead. In Trinity Term 1579, 18-year-old Francis took up residence at Gray's Inn in the former chambers of his father at No. 1 Coney Square, now known as No. 1 Gray's Inn Square. He made rapid progress, and in less than 4 years he was called to the bar, which often took more than twice as long, admitted utter barrister on 27th of June 1582. For the next few years, Bacon seems to have lived a rather secluded existence in his private chambers, frequently refusing visitors, reading and writing anonymously and pseudonymously poetry, drama and philosophy, as well as devoting his time to his law studies. During his time at Gray's Inn, Bacon was de facto master of the revels, writing and producing several masques, entertainments and plays, several of which have survived. Toward the latter end of the decade, Bacon wrote the play entitled The Misfortunes of Arthur, a political allegory about Queen Elizabeth and Mary Queen of Scots, which was performed by members of Gray's Inn before Queen Elizabeth at Greenwich on the 28th of February 1588, a date notable for the singular fact that it marked the beginning of what is known as the Shakespearean era. Its themes and languages find expression and are demonstrably echoed in a significant number of his Shakespeare plays. The Henry VI trilogy, Richard III, Titus Andronicus, King John and the Comedy of Errors, and should be described as his first unacknowledged Shakespeare play. Sometime shortly after the performance of The Misfortunes of Arthur before Queen Elizabeth at Greenwich, Bacon began writing the War of the Roses plays, Henry VI Parts 1, 2 and 3, during the late 1580s or early 1590s. In the Temple Garden scene of the first part of Henry VI, he reveals his intimate familiarity with the habits and life of the Inns of Court. In the invented scene, Bacon portrays the War of Roses between the houses of Lancaster and York as having its nascent beginnings in a dispute between some young noblemen studying law, arguing over an obscure legal point in a passage containing technical legal language set in the Temple Gardens. The argument had clearly become already heated when Suffolk says, "Within the Temple Hall we were too loud, the garden here is more convenient." The Temple Hall was until its dissolution the property and headquarters of the Knights Templar. To explain the too loud, Edward James Castle, Queen's Counsel, pointed out that Rule 8 of the Knights Templar was, "In one common hall or refectory we will that you take your meat together, where, if your wants cannot be made known by signs, ye are softly and privately to ask for what you want." Castle correctly believed the scene in the Temple Gardens indicates it was written by a Gray's Inn lawyer. This reference to the Temple Gardens, not saying whether the inner or the middle temple is meant, curiously enough points to the writer being a member of Gray's Inn. This will be seen better when we discuss the Gesta Grayorum in 1594-5. At present, I shall only point out that there was a strong alliance between Gray's Inn and the Inner Temple. The former, speaking of the latter as the Temple, an Inner or Middle Temple man would have given the inn its proper title. In the Temple Garden, the legal argument continues between the factions in which Somerset says, I have perhaps some shallow spirit of judgment, but in these nice sharp quillets of the law, good faith, I am no wiser than a daw. In his posthumously published The Use of the Law, Bacon uses the term quillet, a subtle distinction or argument, i.e. a quibble used in Acts of Parliament and legal documents. He uses the term quillets again in its various senses in Love's Labour's Lost, Hamlet, Othello, Timon of Athens, and in the second part of Henry VI, in his speech wherein Suffolk proposes to kill Gloucester. And do not stand on quillets how to slay him, be it by gins, by snares, by subtlety. The Temple Garden scene in the first part of Henry VI ends as it began, with Richard Plantagenet saying, "Come, let us fall to dinner. I dare say this quarrel will drink blood another day." This refers to the custom of lawyers dining in messes of 4 at the Inns of Court, a practice referred to by Bacon in passing in a letter to his cousin, Sir Robert Cecil. "I have 3 new knights in my mess in Gray's Inn Commons." In addition to the Temple Garden scene, with its ready familiarity with the life and habits of the Inns of Court, references and allusions to the law run throughout the whole of the play, from the first act until the last. During his first decade at Gray's Inn, his primary residence for the rest of his life, Bacon was in continual personal contact and correspondence with his uncle and aunt, Sir William and Lady Mildred Cecil, sister of his mother, Lady Anne Bacon. All the surviving letters from Bacon to his aunt and uncle are signed from Gray's Inn, where he penned the second part of his Shakespeare trilogy, Henry VI. In 1592, Bacon was commissioned by Cecil to compose a response to a Catholic anti-government tract that had accused Cecil of disloyalty to his sovereign. After robustly defending his uncle Cecil against false and scurrilous accusations levelled against him in the Catholic libel, Bacon proceeds to present a eulogistic account of the man and his character, who he concludes is worthily celebrated as Pater Patres, father of the country in England. The tract by Bacon, entitled Observations upon a Libel, only circulated privately in manuscript and was never published during his lifetime. During this period he wrote the second part of Henry VI, a play which in certain passages, writes Professor Fitter, generated a truly electrifying level of seditious suggestion in late 1591 and 1592, when placed in its immediate historical context. Believing accurately that, preparatory to another invasion by Philip of Spain, a fresh wave of Jesuits was infiltrating the nation to seduce English Catholics from loyalty to the crown, Burleigh, in October 1591, caused a royal proclamation to be issued. In this climate of fresh, high-surveillance hysteria over potential disloyalty to the English monarch, Shakespeare opted not only to dramatise a successful suborning of royal allegiance, but to supply it with steadfast justification on grounds of principle by a beloved and noble character in populous terms that go unrefuted. It logically recalls us to those overtones we picked up in Gloucester of the author of the October Proclamation, Her Majesty's Lord Treasurer, Lord Burleigh. Under the very telling heading, Pater Patres, Fitter makes good the identification of Bacon's uncle and patron, Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, with Lord Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. Unanimously, the Tudor chronicles had presented Gloucester as the good Duke Humphrey, loyal servant of the realm and beloved of the commons. Shakespeare emphatically reproduces the popular gratitude for justice and underlines the Duke's unswerving, impeccable loyalty to the crown. He also, however, introduces a range of further characteristics that must have made identification of Gloucester with Burleigh in the minds of many in the audience entirely inescapable at many significant moments. Another key similarity was a cluster of parallels centering upon the peers' wives. Art thou not second woman of the realm, demands Gloucester of Dame Eleanor, whose sumptuous dress more than hinted at Mildred Cecil, whose splendid garb, worn from the earliest of days of her marriage and reflecting personal pleasure, not a necessary uniform, had been remarked upon by biographers and displayed in portraits. In one of his letters to his maternal uncle, Bacon describes Cecil as the Atlas of this Commonwealth, and in his chapter entitled Second Part of Henry VI, A Commonwealth Tragedy, Dr. Emrys Jones repeatedly characterised the play as a Commonwealth tragedy. For Shakespeare, the key phrase seems to have been bending all his endeavours to the advancement of the Commonwealth. For, as he has written it, Second Part of Henry VI is above all else a play of the Commonwealth, a tragedy in which the Commonwealth protector, the role also performed by Cecil, is conspired against and murdered, and in which, as a result, the Commonwealth is torn to pieces. The play Richard III concludes the first Shakespeare tetralogy covering the War of the Roses. The play was written in the early 1590s, about the time Bacon wrote certain observations upon a libel, written in defence of his uncle Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, in response to certain Catholic libels published abroad and clandestinely circulating in England, libelling Cecil. The editor of the modern Arden edition of Richard III, under the interconnected sections co-texts, invective, satire, libel, and drunken prophecies, libels, emphasises in some detail that it shares its language and protagonist with a tide of contemporary polemic and invective, the most important of it being anti-Cecil, a discourse that peaked dramatically in 1591-2. From the outset, these libels and prophecies, primarily centring around Cecil, employed by its titular character Richard, who, as we shall soon see, was partly modelled on his son, Sir Robert Cecil, sets the tone of the play. Richard employs prophecies and libels, but no known source implicates him for the prophecy about G. However, playing on a letter appears prominently in a 1592 attack on Burleigh, invoking a prophecy that one who had two C's in his name should be the destruction of England. Another 1592 polemic accuses Burleigh himself of instigating prophecies and libels, as if he were responsible for the vain and fond pamphlets and ballads of every idle fellow, said Bacon in the Observations upon a Libel. Bacon's 1592 defence of Burleigh marvels at the sheer variety and number of libellous and defamatory books and writings. Many, like the 1584 copy of a letter, employ terms Richard uses to describe himself in the third part of Henry VI. All serving Burleigh, the primum mobile in every action, is how Bacon describes his uncle. During the period Bacon was writing his first Shakespeare tetralogy, he also composed his Roman history of Titus Andronicus. Its date of composition is unknown. Various dates have been suggested, ranging from 1588 through to 1594, the date of the publication of its first quarto, issued under the title The Most Lamentable Roman Tragedy of Titus Andronicus. Only one copy of the 1594 quarto is known to exist. It was first discovered in Sweden in 1904, that now resides in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington. A few years later, in 1909, a rare copy of the third quarto of Titus Andronicus was found among 8 Shakespeare quartos at Gorhambury, most likely transferred from Bacon's personal library in the old Gorhambury house, which were later transferred for safekeeping into the care of the Bodleian Library, where they still remain to the present day. Could you just imagine the headlines around the world if 8 original Shakespeare quartos were discovered in the house of William Shakespeare of Stratford or one of his relatives or descendants? Legal discourse, states Gregg, saturates Titus Andronicus from the opening lines of the play when Saturninus exclaims, Noble patricians, patrons of my right, defend the justice of my cause with arms, which immediately draws attention to the importance of the law. The play begins with Saturninus and his brother Basanius, sons of the Roman emperor, both setting forth their claim to succeed their father. However, Marcus Andronicus, a tribune of the people, insists that the imperial crown should be placed on the head of his noble and brave brother Titus, as reward for his military victories against the barbarous Goths. In the final scene of the play, Lucius arrives at Titus Andronicus's house for the parley with Emperor Saturninus, bringing with him Aaron and his child as prisoners. Titus, dressed as a cook, welcomes his unwitting guest to the revenge banquet, and assisted by a disguised Lavinia decked with a veil over her face, he serves the meal, made from the mutilated remains of Chiron and Demetrius, urging them to fill their stomachs with the dishes placed before them. Titus then asks Saturninus whether it was just for Virginius to slay his daughter after she was cruelly raped. It was, Saturninus answers. On what grounds? Asks Titus. It was right because she would never have survived her shame. Before murdering Lavinia, Titus says, using the language of the law, a reason mighty, strong, effectual, a pattern, precedent, and lively warrant for me most wretched to perform the like. This statement, points out Professor Thomas Anderson, pointedly refers to the law of contract, which he explains at some length and in impressive detail, that was then occupying the great legal minds of the day, finally officially adjudicated on in the groundbreaking milestone case known as Slade's case. John Slade's case against Humphrey Morley from 1597 to 1602 redefined contract law from a debt-based to an assumpsit-based system, which helps make sense of the complex relationship between the Promissory Speech Act and the staged violence, a relationship that has proved notoriously difficult to explain in accounts of Titus Andronicus. The thorny issues and future implications inherent in the Slade versus Morley case, commonly known as Slade's case, was an important milestone of English contract law, where the new action of assumpsit prevailed over the limited writ of debt had long exercised the best legal minds in Elizabethan England. It was a complex topic of discussion and debate at the four Inns of Court, and in particular with Bacon and other senior members of Gray's Inn, at a time when he was writing and revising Titus Andronicus. After years of legal infighting, Chief Justice Popham decided the conflict between the two courts needed to be resolved and settled upon choosing Slade versus Morley to decide the issue. It was decided the case would be argued before the senior major judges of England in the Exchequer Chamber. The Attorney General, Sir Edward Coke, appeared for the plaintiff Slade, and Doddridge and Bacon represented the defendant Morley. Bacon's detailed knowledge of the principles eventually settled in the Slade case was subtly woven into the text of his Titus Andronicus. Returning to the play, when asked by Saturninus who rapes Lavinia, Titus identifies Chiron and Demetrius and reveals their heads baked in a pie that their mother Tamora had already eaten from. Titus then stabs Tamora, whereupon Saturninus kills Titus and is himself slain by Lucius. To the assembled Romans, Marcus Andronicus and Lucius set out the crimes of Tamora, her lover Aaron, and two sons Chiron and Demetrius, saying, "Now judge what cause had Titus to revenge these wrongs unspeakable, past patience, or more than any living man could bear." The joyous citizens hail Lucius as the new emperor who promises to heal Rome's harms and wipe away her woe. In drawing to a close this legal play of law, justice, and revenge. In his recent Arden edition of Titus Andronicus, under the heading of Revenge, Professor Jonathan Bate discusses the play in relation to Bacon's essay of Revenge. The matter of revenge raises inevitable questions about the institutions of the law. The distinction between private revenge and legal retribution must be made more subtly, as in fact it was by Bacon in his brief essay of Revenge. Barbaric as the feast in the final scene may be, Titus still uses the language of the law. He speaks of precedent and warrant. It is as if the breakdown of established law is such that he has to create a new system of case law based on historical and mythological sources. The theme of revenge structures the whole of Titus Andronicus at every level, and it is the motif that permeates its symbolism, imagery and language in a context of law and justice, whether in the absence of one or both, where one ends and the other begins, and when there is no law or lawful justice, a wild kind of justice, revenge. The Roman history Titus Andronicus shares many affinities with the English history play King John, and vies with it, with some others, for the earliest known Shakespeare drama. There is still considerable disagreement regarding the date of King John on account of its controversial relationship with the anonymous play The Troublesome Reign of King John of England, published in 1591, which are different versions of the same play written by Bacon. The major themes of the two Shakespeare plays of King John include various aspects of the law, inheritance, identity, legitimacy, and its antithesis, bastardy. The last of these provides the pejorative nomenclature for its most important character and largest role in the play, who is given deliberate prominence on its title page, the troublesome reign of John, King of England, with the discovery of King Richard Cordylan's base son, vulgarly named the Bastard Falconbridge. The important character, Philip Falconbridge, the Bastard, has more lines than any other character and is frequently described as the hero of King John, without whom it is said the play would not exist. The play is undoubtedly one of the least known of all the Shakespeare plays, and its central character, the Bastard, unlike the characters of, say, Hamlet or Prospero, remains unfamiliar to the reader and theatregoer. The play, writes Professor Emrys Jones in his brilliant incisive essay King John, the Self and the World, is still misunderstood and absurdly underrated. Like virtually all modern critics, Professor Jones too is irresistibly drawn to the complex, enigmatic and elusive key character in the play. King John would be nothing without the bastard Falconbridge. With him, however, it comes within hailing distance of Hamlet. He is the sensitive moral agent who registers the human temperature of the places through which he moves. Through his responses, the true meaning of the play is mediated to us. The world of King John is, he observes, a place of deceit and deceiving, in which the deceivers are themselves deceived, that portrays the bastard's initiation into high politics, the great world which forms a major plot line. Unlike some other characters in the play, the bastard has an instinct for justice, and justice, with its assumption of a reciprocity, matters to him. The bastard, writes Professor Braunmuller, fully erupts into the play as a sourceless, unlocated character. The very curious and elusive bastard, virtually unhistorical, is Shakespeare's response to the problem of interpreting history. An outsider to many of the play's overt concerns, law, family, politics, he embodies the playwright's own practical need for an analytical consciousness and offers a focus for unifying disparate, uninterrupted events. He is penetrating and profound. He sees further and deeper. He knows and understands more than the self-serving mortals around and about him. He is present, but impressively rises above the noise of deceivers and the deluded, at times both visible and invisible. We think we know him, but he always manages to just stay out of reach. He seems real and unreal, an imaginary character, remarks Eric Sams, who influences events despite his non-existence. The bastard is the great exemplar of the undaunted and undying spirit of England, serving under an unworthy monarch and yet faithful to him as the figurehead of the kingdom. And even if he cannot rule himself, he is a great patriot in the very highest sense of the word, and serves his country in any way he can. Irrespective of his status, legitimate, illegitimate, royal bastard, rightful heir to the crown, however he is recognised by an unseeing and unknowing world, he will, through his play and through his concealed character, speak for England now and for all the times to come. Of all Shakespeare's history plays, King John is the one that most explicitly asks what it might mean to speak for England. It explores questions about legitimacy and inheritance that were of concern to all propertied families in Tudor England, but of monumental significance to the monarchy, especially at a time when an aged, childless queen was sitting on the throne. King John imagines a more challenging possibility. Suppose that a great king dies and that his bravest, most honest and most intelligent son is an illegitimate one. In such a circumstance, inheritance on the basis of merit is not possible. If a bastard were to ascend to the throne, the legitimacy of the entire monarchical system would be called into question. The seamless interdependence of patrilineal state, law, church and family would begin to unravel. Yet the true parentage of the royal bastard, as a son of Richard I, through his secret liaison with Lady Falconbridge, theoretically provides him with a claim to the throne, if the king and his mother, for example, were known to have married in private or secret, but denied him on the grounds of illegitimacy because he was apparently born out of wedlock. And let us not forget the royal bastard was raised as the son of Sir Robert Falconbridge, who it seems was aware very early that he was not his son, and in effect he had raised him on behalf of the king, Richard I. Given the political and legal importance of patrilineal descent, the bastard's true parentage confers a metaphorical claim on the crown, for it links him with Richard I, England's last undoubtedly legitimate king. The fictitious royal bastard is not modelled upon any previous historical figure. His character is a dramatic invention, as are the Falconbridge family and the dispute between the Falconbridge brothers introduced into the first scene of the play. Several Shakespeare scholars have sensed something abstruse, hidden or uncertain in the name of the bastard, Philip Falconbridge. Curiously, in the play he is known by a number of different names. Significantly, perhaps, we are not even clear of his name. His Christian name is Philip, though that is used only once, and after he had been dubbed Sir Richard Plantagenet by the king. Only once is he called Sir Richard by Salisbury, but later Salisbury calls him that misbegotten devil Falconbridge, and it is as the bastard Falconbridge that we usually think of him. It seems the true author of King John had an unusual and very particular attachment to the name of Falconbridge. In his Arden edition of King John, Professor Honigman, who notes the use of the name in a number of other Shakespeare plays, incisively observes, and that Shakespeare was in fact the inventor of it all the Falconbridge elements in his other plays may bear out. For Shakespeare frequently resorted to the name, and this may imply some personal relationship. Indeed, it does imply some kind of special personal relationship with the author of the Shakespeare plays, which can be now revealed here for the first time. The man and name behind the character of the bastard Sir Philip Falconbridge has quite simply stared centuries of Shakespearean and Baconian scholarship in the face. The name of the person behind the character of the bastard is concealed within the first 8 letters of the surname Falconbridge, which contains an anagram of F. Bacon. He too, like Sir Philip Falconbridge, was known by different names. To open history, he is known as Francis Bacon, Sir Francis Bacon, Lord Bacon, Baron Verulam, and Viscount St Alban, as well as a number of other related variants, whereas to secret history, Bacon is known by various other names. Like Falconbridge, Bacon was of royal birth. He was the secret royal son of Queen Elizabeth and the favourite Sir Robert Dudley, Earl of Leicester, and similar to his dramatic nom de plume, who was raised by only one of his natural parents, he was raised by someone other than his two natural parents, in his case Sir Nicholas and Lady Bacon. Bacon also had a secret royal brother, also the son of Elizabeth and Leicester, known to conventional history as Robert Devereaux, Earl of Essex. As seen below, a historical person with the title of the Earl of Essex features in the opening scene of King John, used to introduce the legitimacy dispute between the Falconbridge brothers, whose spectral presence is also felt in several other Shakespeare plays. It therefore comes as little surprise that the themes of identity, legitimacy, bastardy, inheritance, disinheritance, not to mention kingship, are explored throughout the whole Shakespeare canon, beginning, if this is actually the first of his Shakespeare plays, with the troublesome reign of King John of England. From its opening moments, the play makes it clear that John should not, by right, have become King of England. His majesty is borrowed. And since his reign does not rest on law, it must, in the nature of things, stand awry. In this situation, the bastard serves as an illegitimate commentator on an illegitimate reign. Just as King John begins with a trial, the English history play Richard II also opens with a trial scene, in which the king acts as judge and jury in a matter of grave import, wherein two of his leading noblemen accuse each other of treason. He instructs John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, to bring his son Henry Bolingbroke, Duke of Hereford, and Thomas Mowbray, Duke of Norfolk, before him. Then call them to our presence, face to face and frowning brow to brow. Ourselves will hear the accuser and the accused freely speak. The king's cousin, Bolingbroke, future Henry IV, accuses Mowbray of embezzling royal funds and plotting the recent death of the Duke of Gloucester, which he robustly denies, and each of them challenge one another to a duel. The scourge of trial by combat and of duelling had been a source of grievance both morally and legally for Bacon, from his early years studying law at Gray's Inn, and his first task after being appointed Attorney General was to put a stop to it. After consulting with his lawyers, James I issued a proclamation to outlaw the practice, and Bacon submitted a paper, a proposition for the repressing of singular combats or duels, to the same effect. He hoped that the ordinance might not look back to any offence past, and hoped that Parliament would publish a grave and severe proclamation of its own to deter this present mischief. In Richard II, following the aborted trial by combat, the punishment for Bolingbroke and Mowbray was banishment from the realm. Similarly, in his proposition for suppressing singular combats and duels, Bacon recommends that the combatants should be punished with perpetual banishment from the royal courts. Therefore, I do propound that the principal part of the punishment be that the offender, in the cases hereafter set down, be banished perpetually from approach to the courts of the king, queen, or prince. A few weeks later, Bacon arranged to hear a duelling case, initially placed in the hands of Sir Henry Hobart, between two obscure individuals in the Star Chamber, which was soon after published with Bacon's speech and the decree of the court in The Charge of Sir Francis Bacon, Knight, His Majesty's Attorney General, touching duels, upon an information in the Star Chamber against priest and right. My lords, I thought it fit for my place and for these times to bring to hearing before your lordships some cause touching private duels, to see if this court can do any good to tame and reclaim that evil which seems unbridled. A letter written by Sir Edward Hoby on the 7th of December 1595, inviting Sir Robert Cecil to his house in Cannon Row to see King Richard present himself, is regularly adduced as confirmatory evidence for the earliest recorded performance of Richard II. This letter, referred to in nearly all modern editions of Richard II, has been treated very curiously and strangely by modern editors of the play. All serious scholars are more than aware that it is vital how evidence and information is framed and contextualised in any fair, impartial, and, whenever possible, comprehensive discussion and analysis of a subject, in this case a letter, where nothing of any importance or relevance is left out or suppressed. The accounts given by these widely respected editors describing and discussing the letter would all seem to be very carefully presented. Astonishingly, in not one of these standard editions of Richard II published around the English-speaking world does any of the above editors of the play once mention the name of Francis Bacon in connection to the letter from Sir Edward Hoby to Sir Robert Cecil. The sender of it, Sir Edward Hoby, was the eldest son of Sir Thomas Hoby and his wife, Lady Elizabeth Cook Hoby, younger sister of Bacon's mother, Lady Anne Cook Bacon, and his and Bacon's first cousin, its recipient, Sir Robert Cecil, the son of Sir William, brother-in-law of Sir Nicholas Bacon, and Lady Mildred Cook Cecil, elder sister of Lady Bacon, all of whom shared lifelong relationships with Bacon, who all the editors were perfectly aware is, correctly, thought by many to be the secret author of the Shakespeare canon. Lest I forget, there is incredibly one other thing that each and every one of the above editors of Richard II did not draw to the attention of their readers. A manuscript copy of the Shakespeare play Richard II was originally part of Bacon's collection of manuscripts, known as the Northumberland Manuscript, that contained many of his acknowledged writings and dramatic devices. Scribbled on the outside cover of the Northumberland Manuscript are numerous variants of the names Bacon, Francis Bacon, Shakespeare and William Shakespeare, with special attention called to the telling line written above the entry for Richard II. By Mr. Francis William Shakespeare, and further down the page the word your is written twice across the name William Shakespeare, reading Your William Shakespeare. As we are here discussing the law in the Shakespeare plays, it is profoundly regrettable that this kind of systematic suppression is itself not illegal. The Northumberland Manuscript also originally contained a copy of the Orations at Gray's Inn Revels, the speeches of 6 councillors addressed to the Prince of Purple at the Gray's Inn Revels, that presented a series of entertainments over the Christmas period of 1594-5, most notably the first known performance of Bacon's Shakespeare legal play, The Comedy of Errors. A groundbreaking historical background to these entertainments at Gray's Inn has recently been set out for the first time by Professor Virginia Lee Strain in her long introduction to legal reform in English Renaissance literature, which served as an illuminating preface to the first chapter of Part 1 entitled Snaring Statutes and the General Pardon in the Gesta Grayorum. In her introduction, Professor Strain states that the complex process of legal reform found representation in the Gray's Inn Revels of 1594-5, which began in the Elizabethan reign with Sir Nicholas Bacon and was continued by his son Francis Bacon, whose writings shaped the historical development of English law and ethos of legal reform at the end of the 16th century through the early part of the 17th century and beyond. As a primary instrument of the state's self-regulation, legal reform entailed in Nicholas Bacon's words, the perfection and execution of the law, I have adopted Bacon's division of legal reform into the perfection and execution of the law for the structure of this book. The future perfection of the law, which preoccupied Sir Nicholas Bacon throughout his legal career as a senior law officer in the first part of the Elizabethan reign, formed the central premise of the writings of his son Francis from his early years to his last. Nicholas and Francis Bacon described the future perfection of the law as the responsibility of the present sovereign, statesmen, legislators, judges and magistrates, which could be achieved through processes that looked not to the matter of the laws, but to the manner. Drawing to a close her innovative introduction defining the historical backgrounds to Elizabethan legal reform, largely through the policy speeches of the Lord Keeper Sir Nicholas Bacon, to emphasise its continuation through the second half of the reign, Professor Strain provides a linking narrative and contextual nexus leading to Bacon's Gesta Graeorum and the Comedy of Errors. The Christmas revellers mounted a large mock court, and the elaborate entertainments for their fictional Prince of Purple were performed by and before a community of inn members and associates that included common law students, legal professionals, courtiers, parliamentarians and statesmen. In their abridged parliament they mock the general pardon that compensated for the snaring statutes that had accrued over the course of the 16th century. These kinds of statutes, which turned subjects into unintentional lawbreakers, found their way into Shakespeare's comedies. Francis Bacon's subsequent orations on government redirect the course of the entertainments away from the comical errors of lawmakers and legal representative towards the industrious, systematic reform of the fictional state. On the 20th of December, the Prince of Purple, with the royal train, marched from his lodgings to the Great Hall of Gray's Inn and took his place on the throne under a cloth of state. With his councillors and great lords placed around him, and his council and lawyers seated at the table, the trumpets sound thrice to signal the commencing of the revels. In front of his court, the Prince of Purple beareth his shield of the highest Jupiter, in point a sacred imperial diadem, safely guarded by the helmet of the great goddess Pallas, the symbol of the most heroical order knighthood of the helmet, which rendered its wearer invisible, as with the order of the Brotherhood of the Rosy Cross, secretly founded by Bacon, otherwise known as the Invisibles. The next grand night, on the 28th of December, a great presence of lords, ladies and worshipful personages that did expect some notable performance made their way into the hall. In what was on this remarkable grand night at the Gray's Inn revels, organised, directed and presided over by Bacon, its de facto master of the revels, that his great play on the themes of errors and confusions was premiered to an audience of lawyers. The Gesta Graeorum, with its central themes of errors and confusion, and its centrepiece play, The Comedy of Errors, based upon the themes of errors and confusion, were devised by one directing mind or grand sorcerer of Gray's Inn, the grand master of these illusions, Lord Bacon. The figure of the sorcerer or conjurer, master of illusions, is on many different levels central to the concealed authorship and writing of the Shakespeare plays. Shakespeare is a conjurer, the conjurer is Shakespeare. The sorcerer Bacon, the concealed dramatist Shakespeare, conjured up the Comedy of Errors, a play which dramatises the complex notions of error and mistaken identity that bedevil the human mind and has proved the cause of endless delusions throughout history and Bacon Shakespeare scholarship. In the modern edition of the Comedy of Errors, its editor, Professor Cartwright, under the heading Error and Identity, the idea of error, what error drives our eyes and ears amiss, informs his readers that the idea of error fascinated Renaissance thinkers. The humanist movement attacked what it perceived as empirical, philological and epistemological errors, from Lorenzo Valla and Erasmus to Francis Bacon's critique of erroneous methods of proof. These words scarcely scratch the surface. In fact, Bacon's whole philosophical system and scientific empirical methodological inquiry, to which he devoted his entire lifetime and wrote several large treatises, departed from the premise that mankind had for thousands of years wandered through error upon error in what might very well be described as a veritable comedy of errors. It was this very foundation on which Bacon built his first major philosophical treatise, which he aptly titled The Advancement of Learning, wherein in some instances he actually began page after page with the word error in describing the phenomenon of historical and human error. The first two paragraphs of which, given below, can be applied to his authorship of the Shakespeare plays, including, of course, the Comedy of Errors, presently under discussion. Another error induced by the former is a distrust that anything should be now to be found out which the world should have missed and passed over so long time. For the truth is that time seemeth to be of the nature of a river or stream, which carrieth down to us that which is light and blown up, and sinketh and drowneth that which is weighty and solid. Later, in The Advancement of Learning, Bacon directly alludes to Terence and Plautus, the Roman playwrights, whose Latin play Menaechmi, the Comedy of Errors, is based upon. It decideth also the controversies between Zeno and Socrates, and their schools and successions on the one side, who placed felicity in virtue simply or attended, the actions and exercises whereof do chiefly embrace and concern society, and on the other side the Cyrenaics and Epicureans, who placed it in pleasure, and made virtue, as it is used in some comedies of errors, wherein the mistress and the maid change habits, to be put as a servant, without which pleasure cannot be served and attended. In addition to the snaring statutes which frames the whole play, the central motive of the gold chain which runs throughout the Comedy of Errors has recently been identified by several modern authorities on Shakespeare, and the law as a complex metaphor for the developing law of contract between the action of debt and action of assumpsit being fought out between the Court of Commons Pleas and the King's Bench. The controversial and complicated legal issue had occupied Bacon's mind for many years at Gray's Inn during the 1580s and 1590s, and had long been a source of infighting between the two courts, which led Chief Justice Popham to select Slade v. Morley as a test case to finally settle the issue. The case, which was argued before all the major judges of England, with Attorney General Sir Edward Coke appearing for the plaintiff Slade and Doddridge and Bacon appearing for the defendant Morley, ran from 1596 to 1602. In his essay Consideration, Contract and the End of the Comedy of Errors, Dr. Zurcher explains that the common law of contract was changing rapidly at precisely the time that the Comedy of Errors was written and first performed. Slade's case was still a few years off when Shakespeare penned it, but the tensions that finally led Chief Justice Popham to convoke the judges of the realm in consultation on Slade v. Morley were certainly active in 1594. The structure and central plot and mirroring relationships in the play are predicated on the tension between the action of debt and action of assumpsit. The twinning narrative structure of the Comedy of Errors comes to imitate, that is to say anticipate, the quandary in which the common law judges would find themselves during the arguments over Slade's case in 1598. Antipholus of Ephesus has made Angelo a promise, but has not received consideration for it, whereas Antipholus of Syracuse has received the consideration but made no promise. What Shakespeare has effectively allegorised in The Brothers was one of the chief points of contention during Slade's case. In Baker's words, whether a contract and a contemporaneous promise to perform it would give rise simultaneously to two distinct forms of action to achieve the same end. In the section, The Chain, Symbol of Commerce, Love and Law, Professor Raffield writes that the symbolism of the chain is multifaceted. The linking thread which weaves itself throughout the whole play and is fundamental to the relationships of its key characters, acting as a bond, writes Professor Krebs, an image appropriate indeed to the close connections the plot draws between love, money and truth. Further, declares Professor Cartwright in the modern Arden edition of the Comedy of Errors, the chain becomes mystified by Syracusan Antipholus' treatment of it as a golden gift, associated with Ephesian witchcraft and sorcery. It is a figure in the play and of the play. The golden chain that runs through the Comedy of Errors represents and symbolises the endless chain of human existence, which traces all the way back to the beginning of time and the mysteries of the heavens and the universe, esoteric secrets which are withheld and hidden from us. The divine fable of the golden chain, alluded to in Homer's Iliad and Plato's Theaetetus, is referred to twice by Bacon in the Advancement of Learning, not highlighted by the above. For, in the entrance of philosophy, when the second causes, which are next unto the senses, do offer themselves to the mind of man, if it dwell and stay there, it may induce some oblivion of the highest cause. But when a man passeth on farther, and seeth the dependence of causes and the works of providence, then, according to the allegory of the poets, he will easily believe that the highest link of nature's chain must needs be tied to the foot of Jupiter's chair. The great golden chain of being is more explicitly referred to by Bacon in Book 2, during the course of a discussion on divine philosophy. For the heathen themselves conclude as much in that excellent and divine fable of the golden chain, that men and gods were not able to draw Jupiter down to earth, but contrariwise Jupiter was able to draw them up to heaven. So as we ought not to attempt to draw down or submit the mysteries of God to our reason, but contrariwise to raise and advance any reason to the divine truth. In atonement for the Night of Errors, contrived for the performance of the Comedy of Errors, for the next grand night at the Gray's Inn Revels on the 3rd of January 1595, Bacon invited a number of great and noble personages, among them his uncle and cousin, Sir William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, and his son, Sir Robert Cecil, the favourite Robert Devereaux, Earl of Essex, Henry Wriothesley, the Earl of Southampton, who was at Gray's Inn with Bacon from 1589 and to whom Bacon had dedicated his Shakespeare poems Venus and Adonis and the Rape of Lucrece the year before, and Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland, where at the residence of his descendant, the Earl Percy, Bacon's Northumberland Manuscript was discovered that once housed his Shakespeare plays Richard II and Richard III. In front of the distinguished guests, in echoing the Comedy of Errors at the end of the Prince of Purple, placed around the neck of the Inner Temple's ambassador, a carcanet or bejewelled collar, the golden chain of being, the symbol of the knighthood of the helmet, an order of his own institution, i.e. his Rosicrucian Freemasonry Brotherhood, and 24 of his retinue all vowed to observe and practice the constitutions and ordinances of the Honourable Order. When the King at Arms had read the articles of the Order of the Knighthood and concluded all its ceremonies, the Knights of the Order brought into the hall a banquet for the Prince of Purple and the Lords in imitation of the feast celebrated at all such honourable institutions. Then a table was set on the stage before the Prince and 6 Lords of his Privy Council, all delivered speeches written by Bacon. The 6 speeches are framed as a response to the Prince's request for the best directions on the happiness of the state. In the 5th Councillor's speech on government, Bacon presents a plea for the reform of the existing machinery of the law and the state, which he says is the making of golden times and the only and worthy ends of your Grace's virtuous reign. He advises the prince that the first law of any state is security, to assure yourself of an inward peace, that the storms without do not disturb any of your repairers of state within. The prince should visit all the parts of your state and take especial care of your intelligence, which is the light of the state. Bacon proceeds to advise him. Then look into the state of your laws and justice of your land. Purge out a multiplicity of laws, clear the uncertainty of them, repeal those that are snaring, and press the execution of those that are wholesome and necessary. Define the jurisdiction of your courts, repress all suits and vexations, all causeless delays and fraudulent shifts and devices, and reform all such abuses of right and justice. Assist the ministers thereof, punish severely all extortions and exactions of officers, all corruptions in trials and sentences of judgment. Thus ended the last of the grand nights directed by Bacon at the Christmas Gray's Inn revels of 1594-5. It is undeniable and demonstrable that Shakespeare was a lawyer, and that the lawyer was Francis Bacon, Solicitor General, Attorney General, Lord Keeper and Lord Chancellor of England.